During the last years of the Second World War, while the Third Reich crumbled on the battlefields, some of the most technological projects were being developed unusual and ambitious of the history modern. The engineers Nazis developed prototypes that seemed to come from a science fiction novel: rocket fighters, stealth aircraft, suborbital technologies, and intercontinental missiles. Many of these inventions never saw combat, but their bases, plans, and prototypes were abandoned and recovered by the United States. Among these amazing projects stands out the DFS-346, a plane space designed to reach supersonic speeds, although it never took off. In addition, the Horten Ho 229, the first aircraft with stealth technology designed to evade Allied radars. The Messerschmitt ME163 Comet, meanwhile, was the fastest fighter of his time, but his scarce autonomy it returned almost useless. Still further strange was the Baham Bar-349 NATA, an expendable vertical fighter designed for suicide missions. However, nothing beats the concept of the Silbervogel, a suborbital bomber capable of crossing continents at hypersonic speeds, or the V-2 rocket, the first long-range ballistic missile, a direct precursor to the Soviet and American space programs. The first long-range ballistic missile, the creation of the V-2 rocket. The V-2 rocket was the first ballistic missile in history. This device, also known as the V-2 bomb, was the culmination of the dream of Werner from Braun and humanity's nightmare. This long-range bomb was developed by a team of German engineers under the direction of the brilliant, ambitious, and contradictory Werner von Braun. The Vergeltungswaffe II, Revenge Weapon II, was the Third Reich's most advanced weapons project. Its technical name was Aggregate 4, but no one remembers it by that designation. The V-2 was just another bomb. It was the first man-made device to leave Earth's atmosphere and re-enter to cause mass destruction. It was science fiction technology in the middle of World War II. The missile was 14 meters long, weighed more than 12 tons, and transported a head explosive of 1,000 kilograms of amatol. His engine of fuel liquid, based on ethanol and liquid oxygen, it propelled it to speeds exceeding 5,700 kilometers per hour, reaching an altitude of up to 90 kilometers before plunging toward its target at supersonic speed. And the most terrifying thing was that it could not be stopped. No fighter could reach it. Radars were incapable of detecting it in time. No anti-aircraft battery was effective. When the citizens heard the explosion, it was the first and last sign of that AV-2 there was been launched. No, there was a warning, only destruction. His first launch operational occurred 8 September 1944 over London. Within seconds, a crater opened in the ground. Bodies were torn to pieces, buildings reduced to ruins. It was just the beginning. Over the next few months, more than 3,000 V-2 missiles were fired, mainly against England, Belgium and France, causing further of 9,000 civilian deaths. Technically, the V-2 was a prodigious feat. It was equipped with the inertial guidance that adjusted its trajectory using gyroscopes and servo mechanisms. It featured steering control via nozzle fins and movable aerodynamic surfaces. Its launch required complex mobile platforms, precise logistics, and a distributed production network. But even so, despite all these difficulties, the V-2 worked, and each shot was a declaration of the destructive power the Reich was still capable of wielding. But the creation of the V-2 has an even darker story: the human cost of its manufacture. Instead of using conventional factories, the Nazis chose to hide its production in underground tunnels to avoid Allied bombing. Thus was born the Mittelwerk, a facility near Nordhausen, operated by manual labor, slave of the field Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. More of 20,000 prisoners died building the missiles, already out by hunger, disease, exhaustion, either executions. Ironically, more people died making the V-2 than from its impact in combat. In strategic terms, the V-2 didn't change the course of the war. Its accuracy was limited, as it could deviate several kilometers from the target, and its production cost was astronomical. Each missile represented a massive investment of resources and time, even using slave labor. In an already collapsed Germany, randomly launching missiles at civilian cities wasn't a victory, it was a desperate cry from the grave. But in other sense, changed the history. With the V-2, he world saw for the first time the skies no longer offered refuge. That war could come from space, and that scientific knowledge, devoid of ethics, could be transformed in a monster without control. When the Third Reich collapsed, the victorious powers raced to capture not only the missiles, but also their creators. Von Braun, along with hundreds of German engineers, was taken to the United States under Operation Paperclip. There he would work on military rocket programs and later at NASA, designing none other than the Saturn V that would take man to the moon. The legacy of the V2 is, thus, as paradoxical as it is disturbing, from the Nazi horror to Apollo 11. In his final days, Hitler dreamed of miracle weapons that could reverse the defeat. But the V2, as revolutionary as it was, only demonstrated the degree of despair of the regime. It was a masterpiece of engineering in service of collapse. A supersonic projectile, a fleeting shadow, a vertical bolt of lightning that fell from above without warning. Silbervogel, the plane suborbital of the Third Reich. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, while the world watched in horror as the Wehrmacht advanced across Europe in the most secret corners of the Nazi regime, a group of engineers worked on a project that seemed to come from a science fiction novel, the Silbervogel, the bird. Silver, a suborbital bomber that could have changed the history of war and the planet. The concept was conceived by the young Austrian physicist Eugen Sänger and his colleague Irene Brett, who developed a radically innovative idea. It was of a rocket-propelled aircraft capable of reaching the upper atmosphere, bouncing off it and cross half-world before of launch a bomb about States United. The project was officially called Silbervogel and was part of a program most ambitious, the America Bomber, a desperate attempt by the Reich to extend its destructive capacity beyond the Atlantic. The idea was simple in theory and revolutionary in practice. The Silbervogel would be launched from a specially designed runway by means of a 3-kilometer catapult that would accelerate it to 1,850 kilometers per hour, 1,150 miles per hour. Once in motion, its liquid-fueled rocket engines would propel it into the stratosphere to an altitude of 145 kilometers, 90 miles per hour. At that height, instead of flying continuously like a conventional aircraft, the Silbervogel would take advantage of a physical phenomenon called skip glide, gliding on the boundary between the atmosphere and space, losing altitude and regaining it again in a sequence of jumps hypersonic, like a stone bouncing on the surface of water. Its projected scope was extraordinary, could travel from Germany until New York, drop a bomb weighing between 3 and 5 tons and continue its trajectory toward Japan or land in the Pacific. The real objective was not just military. For Hitler, this project involved a symbol, the possibility of extending the hand of the Reich further beyond the continent, proving that his vision could become a planetary nightmare. However, the challenges were almost insurmountable. The fuselage had to withstand temperatures nearby to the 1,500 degrees Celsius by the friction with the atmosphere. The guidance and navigation system was, for the time, absolutely rudimentary, and the infrastructure necessary to launch the aircraft, such as the runway and catapult, existed only in blueprints. The Reich lacked materials capable of withstanding such thermal stress, nor reliable orbital guidance systems. Even Sänger's design foresaw a complex re-entry atmospheric pressure that would have jeopardized any mission. Despite everything, the project went ahead, at least on paper. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, himself showed interest in the concept, although he quickly classified it as a technically fascinating fantasy but useless for the purposes of the project. Immediate of the war. Hermann Göring shared the same opinion, diverting funds to more immediate developments, such as jet fighters and the V-1 and V-2 flying bombs. When the war ended, the Allies found Sänger and Brett's documents in abandoned facilities in southern Germany. What had seemed impossible began to interest the new masters of the world. The United States and the Soviet Union fought not only over Nazi scientists through the Operation Paperclip, but also its ideas. The Project Silbervogel was one of the most examined. In fact, some of its principles later inspired the design of the X-20 Dinosaur, a space glider that the Americans developed in the 1960s and that served as the conceptual basis for the space shuttles decades later. The Silverbird never flew. It didn't destroy New York. It didn't fly over the Pacific as a symbol of the global Third Reich. But the mere fact that such an idea was conceived during a war in the 20th century is a testament to the level of ambition and even delirium that marked Nazi Germany. In the aftermath of its defeat were left not only ruins and crimes, but also the seeds of the future space race. Baham B, a 349 NATA, the disposable fighter. In the throes of the Third Reich, when German skies were the absolute domain of Allied bombers, desperate ideas emerged to halt the impending collapse. One of the most radical was the Baham BA 349 NATA, a hybrid rocket plane aircraft designed not for prolonged aerial combat, but for a single objective: take off vertically, shoot down a bomber, and disappear into oblivion, or explode in the attempt. The concept was born in 1944 by Erich Baham, an engineer who, in collaboration with the Luftwaffe, presented a bold and unprecedented plan: an interceptor fighter that could be launched from a ramp fully propelled by rockets, without landing gear, without post-attack maneuverability, and with low-cost, rapidly manufactured components. In other words, a suicide machine like the Japanese kamikazes, although officially would be manned only by volunteer patriots, since the Reich would never accept using Aryan Germans as cannon fodder. The NATA was small, barely 5 meters long, with a fuselage built largely of wood due to the shortage of aluminum. It was equipped with a Walter HWK 109-509A-2 main rocket motor, the same that drove to the ME163 Comet, and 4 side-mounted Schmidding boosters to give it vertical lift when taking off from a fixed platform. Its mode of operation was as brief as it was disturbing. Once launched vertically, it would ascend to reach the altitude of the Allied bombers, lined up with the target, and shot one save of rockets Henschel H-217 from his nose. After he stroked, the pilot had to release the nose of the plane, eject with a parachute, while the fuselage would disintegrate or fall off. The nose pod, theoretically recoverable, contained the targeting and weapons systems. Without embargo, the tests were tragic. The first and only manned flight was carried out the 1st of March of 1945 with the pilot of evidence Lothar Sieber to board. During takeoff, the NATA veered uncontrollably, made an upward turn, and it crashed to the ground, killing Sieber. It was the first manned vertical takeoff in history and also the first catastrophic failure. Despite the disaster, around 30 were built. Some were deployed near Stuttgart but were never used in combat. The advance of the Allied troops prevented any possibility of use. Real, and the remains of the project were discovered by American forces in April 1945. It that does to the NATA so singular, no, is only his audacity technique, but he concept the sacrifice it represented. It was a machine conceived as disposable, a symbol of a war that could no longer be won with conventional strategies. Its design combined desperation, innovation, and disregard for the life of the pilot, reduced to a functional tool. After the war, Allied engineers carefully examined the plans and captured units. Although the concept was not exactly replicated, its vertical launch and modular design anticipated certain developments in military rockets and missiles. Ground-to-air in the 1950s, the BA 349 NATA was a final act of aerodynamic madness. Not because of its failure, but because of its daring. It represents the last gasp of a regime that, besieged by imminent defeat, continued to dream of impossible weapons. Messerschmitt ME163 Comet, the fastest fighter and useless. In the middle of World War II, when the skies of Europe began to be tinged with Allied bombers, Germany bet by the speed as a weapon. The creation of the Messerschmitt ME163 Comet was he tried further radical attempt to achieve air superiority through extreme innovation. It was the first rocket fighter in the world and also the only one to see combat. But its history, although swift, was also tragically short. Designed by the brilliant engineer Alexander Lippisch, the ME163 was a beast unparalleled. It had no propeller, neither conventional engines, no counted neither, not even with a retractable landing gear, and yet was capable of reaching 960 kilometers per hour in just a few seconds. Shape triangular with at delta, it toward seemed further a manned missile than a traditional aircraft. Fueled by he powerful but the unstable Walter HWK 109-509 engine ran on a hypergolic mixture of 2 fuels, C-Stoff, a blend of hydrazine and methanol, and T-Stoff, a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide compound. Together, they generated a brutal thrust, but also a lethally volatile combination. His procedure of flight was so brief as dangerous. His Comet took off from a gliding skid, assisted by a small auxiliary gear that detached after takeoff. In seconds, it reached a vertical speed of up to 11,000 meters per minute. Once at the desired altitude, the pilot had just 5 minutes of power to intercept the enemy bombers, fire its two 30mm Mk-108 cannons, and then glide without an engine back to Earth. The landing was made on the fixed skid, in conditions that often damaged the fuselage and injured the pilot. On paper, the Comet was a nightmare for Allied bombers, as it was theoretically impossible to hit by escort fighters faster than any existing aircraft, and armed with cannons powerful enough to destroy a B-17 in a single shot. But in practice, its virtues were diluted in the face of enormous limitations. The effective combat time was minimal, the aim, I was coming back almost impossible to the speeds reached, and the opportunities to intercept an enemy were extremely limited. The pilots also ran a constant risk. The mixture of fuels was so reactive that a simple landing route could blow up the plane. Many died, burned, torn to pieces, or suffocated by the gases. Only 9 bombers' enemies were knocked down officially by the ME163 aircraft were used throughout the war. In return, more than 10 Comets were lost in accidents or operational failures. Despite its limitations, the Comet had a profound impact on the Allied forces. The sight of a propellerless craft rising vertically like a meteor generated confusion and fear. Its presence forced a change in bombing tactics and demonstrated that Germany was still pursuing weapons of technological revenge. Production of the ME163 continued until the end of the conflict, with more than 300 units built, although only a fraction was deployed in combat. The squadrons that operated them, such as the JG-400, faced constant technical problems, lack of fuel, and a rate of accidents very high. Still, their pilots were considered part of an almost suicidal elite. After the war, United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom captured several specimens and they submitted to extensive evidence. ME163 influenced in studies about at Delta, aerodynamic fuselages and rocket engines. In a way, it was an ancestor conceptual of experimental aircraft such as the American X-15. The first invisible aircraft in history, the Luftwaffe's Horten Ho 229. Among the most curious discoveries of Nazi aviation research, the Horten Ho 229 stands as a disturbingly futuristic relic of the World War II. Created by the Horten brothers, the jet-powered, flying wing-shaped craft offered a radical design, reducing radar cross-section and eerily foreshadowing the development of modern stealth bombers. Completed prototypes underwent flight testing that demonstrated aerodynamics so advanced they could rival concepts later used in contemporary aircraft, such as the B-2 Spirit bomber, although the Ho 229 was built primarily of plywood and other lightweight composites. The Ho 229's aerodynamic shape was intended to minimize drag and achieve high speeds, taking advantage of its dual jet engines. The Luftwaffe saw great potential in a fast fighter bomber that could outperform Allied aircraft. The Horten Ho 229 was a single-seat aircraft, 7.4 meters long and with a wingspan of 16.8 meters. Its glider-like shape meant that the nose height was only 2.81 meters with a cockpit of a metro of high. As it is a flying wing, its surface to alarm was of 50.2 meters. Empty, Ho 229 weighed 4,600 kilograms, to which were added 1,700 kilograms of fuel that enabled a maximum operational range of 1,900 kilometers. This also applied to the bomb load, which was up to 2,000 kilograms, which exceeded the Chief of Staff's expectations, the Luftwaffe. Fully loaded, the Ho 229 could weigh up to 8,100 kilograms. All this bulk had to fly at a speed close to 1,000 kilometers per hour. The Horten brothers did not manage to reach this number, but they came pretty close. The power plant consisted of 2 Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines, which gave the plane a top speed of 960 kilometers per hour, a cruising speed of 900 kilometers per hour, and a flight ceiling of 15,000 meters. In addition, of the typical bombs of the time, the Ho 229 had 2 cannons, Mk-108 The first test of this aerial Wunderwaffen happened 1st of March of 1944. The test was relatively successful, although the design presented some problems that made the pilot's task difficult. In addition to wood, they used alloys of lightweight metal to avoid wind resistance. while improving its indetectability forward to the radars. He, too, of February of 1945, he tried it that I would be the final version of the Ho 229, but tragedy struck the prototype. One of the engines stopped in mid-flight, and the pilot should have carried out a maneuver miraculous to save his life and the aircraft. Despite this, development continued. The Allies were pounding to the doors of Berlin, and the Nazis were looking for a weapons savior. But it never arrived. The Horten Ho 229 never left. The hangars joined to the struggle. Hitler's regime fell first. In 1945, the Allies found the captured Ho 229 inside the Operation Paperclip, a Western effort to harness Nazi-developed technology as well as their best engineers and scientists. The prototype traveled to England and then to the United States, where it found a home between the Smithsonian Museum and the workshops of Northrop Grumman, the company that created the B-2 Spirit, a strategic and undetectable bomber. That accomplished capture the essence of the Horten Ho 229. Until the day of today, the Americans continue investigating the development of the Horten brothers, who, while never saw the light of day, it turned out to be a fundamental contribution to U.S. military air technology. DFS-346, the spaceplane that never took off. In the later stages of the Second World War, when it was already evident that the Third Reich could not reverse its defeat on the battlefields, German secret laboratories continued to develop technologies that they grazed it impossible. Among them was one of Nazi Germany's most mysterious and futuristic projects, the DFS-346, an experimental aircraft designed to fly at supersonic speeds of over 30,000 meters of altitude. In essence, It was an attempt to build a spaceplane in the 1940s. The development of the DFS-346 began in wind tunnels of the Institute German Gliding Research Institute, from which it takes its name by the German acronym. The design was spearheaded by engineer Felix Kracht and later perfected by Hans Rössing and Wolfgang von Dierich, who conceived a device with clean lines, a fuselage slim and narrow, optimized for break the sound barrier in a time in that neither not even existed an engine reliable to do so. The DFS-346 had no conventional propellers or jets. It was equipped with a hydrogen peroxide and kerosene rocket engine thought to be launched from high altitude by a mother bomber like the Junkers Ju 388 or the Heinkel He 274. The craft, once released at about 10,000 meters altitude, would ignite its propellant and ascend in a suborbital flight, theoretically reaching speeds close to Mach 2, further of 2,400 kilometers per hour. The pilot would be located in a pressurized capsule with an ejection seat, equipped with oxygen systems and advanced controls, a luxury unheard for the standards of the time. But the DFS-346 wasn't just a promise of speed. It was also a commitment to research into high-altitude flight. At a time when the Luftwaffe no longer dominated the skies, the Nazi regime dreamed of flying over them all, unopposed. Flying above the fighters, further there of the scope of any radar, either missile anti-aircraft, in a world where the airplanes were almost ships spacecraft. The project was not completed before the end of the war. When Soviet forces entered East Germany, they found several unfinished prototypes at the Dessau facility. Unlike other projects that were captured by the United States, DFS-346 passed into Soviet hands, becoming one of the best-kept secrets of the post-war period. For several years, engineers Soviets the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau's management worked on the development and testing of the DFS-346. At least 3 test flights were made between 1947 and 1951, using modified versions launched from Tu-4 bombers. However, the results were unsatisfactory. The device suffered issues of control to high speeds, the pressurized cabin was defective, and atmospheric re-entry was extremely unstable. Finally, the program was abandoned, and DFS-346 disappeared in oblivion. Still, its legacy lived on. The swept-wing design and the idea of ejection pods were later adopted by the Soviets. In the series of fighters, MiG, and also indirectly influenced Western experimental designs. The DFS-346 was a vision ahead of its time, an almost single-handed attempt to conquer the stratosphere in an era where even transonic flight was not yet fully understood. That Germany, in the midst of the collapse total still bet by these projects, demonstrate that Nazi science did not stop at any technical impossibility. While the fronts collapsed, some engineers of the Reich They kept looking at the sky, convinced that the next war would be fought in the stars. The shocking Nazi UFO, Hitler's infamous Bell, Die Glocke. As the Third Reich crumbled, emerged rumors about a super top-secret Nazi weapon, a device so advanced it was going to change the course of the war at the last minute. The truth is that this myth accompanied the discovery of dozens of Nazi superweapons, known as the Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. If good some of he they took to Cape, the most no-past of it could have been a crazy idea of engineers close to Hitler, who was prone to fantasizing about science fiction designs. But there was one project in particular that, to this day, confounds researchers and historians. We're talking about Die Glocke, which means the bell. This enigmatic machine became one of the most chilling and controversial mysteries of the Second World War. The Glock is described as a device made of a hard, heavy metal with a diameter approximate of 2.7 meters and a height between 3.7 and 4.6 meters, having a shape similar to that of a large bell. According to the plans and reports found by the researchers, this device contained two counter-rotating cylinders that would be filled with a substance similar to the mercury of violet color. This liquid metal, whose existence he checked never, had codenamed Zerum 525 and was stored in a tall, thin thermos, 1 meter high and encapsulated in lead, which indicated its supposed toxicity. According to these accounts, when the bell was activated, it had a radius of action of 150 meters. At depths of 200 meters, crystals formed on animal tissue, blood gelled and separated, while plants decomposed into a fat-like substance. Supposedly, during the development of the dangerous device, 5 of the 7 scientists originally working on the project died from these effects. The tests would have been carried where today he find the ruins of a concrete structure nicknamed the Henge in the vicinity of the mine Wenceslas, to some 3 kilometers southeast of the main Sokolek complex of the Deriza project underground workings, which may also have served as a test platform for an experiment in anti-gravity propulsion generated with the bell. Other accounts placed him in a facility near the Czech border, guarded by the SS. Most historians accepted by the Academy consider the claims linked to the bell to be mere hearsay, as it appears in very little official documentation. Of the time of the war, no confirmed plans or official references have been produced apart from scattered anecdotes. However, there is speculation that fragments of research projects Royal could have been distorted over time. It is widely accepted that the Nazis experimented in fields such as propulsion and particle physics, often dispersed across multiple secret laboratories, but to way of the attractive chilling story, it is possible that Die Glocke is simply a creation that condenses several separate technological efforts into a single fantastic story. The truth is that the doubt persists to this day, and many conspiracy and UFO theory fans believe that Die Glocke was part of a top-secret project which was trying to create flying saucers capable of escaping a war-torn Earth. Reich's awe-inspiring Death Star. At the margins where science becomes delirium, Nazi Germany explored ideas that bordered on fiction, further extravagant. Of the further disturbing was the Sonnengewehr, or solar weapon, a theoretical project devised by Luftwaffe scientists to create a cannon orbital able to concentrate the good heavens of the sun and burn entire cities from space. A superweapon that, if developed, would have altered not only warfare but human history itself. The origin of the solar gun can be traced back to 1929, when German physicist Hermann Oberth, a pioneer of modern astronautics, proposed the possibility of placing giant mirrors in orbit to redirect the light solar. The idea, in principle, it was not a military one, but an energetic one. It was proposed as a method to harness solar radiation on a large scale. But in the context of the Third Reich, the proposal, it was quickly reconfigured for military purposes. Beginning in 1941, a group of German scientists linked to the Luftwaffe presented an ambitious design, consisting of a 3.5-kilometer diameter concave mirror placed on a space station at an altitude of 8,200 kilometers. This mirror, constructed of polished metal plates, would concentrate the sun's rays on a specific point on the Earth's surface, generating enough heat to destroy cities, evaporate reservoirs, or incinerate moving troops. The station, theoretically manned, would include control panels, guidance systems, and extended life equipment. Calculations suggested that with proper alignment, The sun could be transformed into a death ray capable of frying any enemy of the Reich from a distance. The project became a technical obsession for some sectors, although many within the High Command considered it simply unrealizable. And it was. In the 1940s, Germany lacked the rockets capable of carrying such a structure into space, the technology for orbital navigation, and materials capable of withstanding the hostile environment outside the atmosphere. Even maintenance in orbit was unthinkable. Concept was a chimera, a dream of global domination turned into a celestial weapon. However, the solar gun became so advanced in its theoretical calculations that, after the war, the documents from the project were recovered by US forces. Scientists from the US space program, including some working on Project Horizon and later at NASA, studied the possibilities of building solar platforms for energy purposes, though never for military purposes. In 1945, Life magazine published a sensational article that described the solar gun as if it had been a real threat. The truth was further modest, but no less disturbing, since was trying of an idea advanced, developed about paper with mathematical rigor, and completely detached from the material limitations of its time. Interest in the concept persisted throughout the Cold War. Both the Soviet Union, as states joined, developed proposals for orbital weapons, including solar power platforms and systems destruction from space. None ever reached the operational phase, but the germ of those ideas had already been planted in recent years of the Third Reich. Sunbeam No was not built, nor did it cause any destruction. But its very conception speaks of a complex mentality that, faced with its imminent destruction, preferred to imagine absolute control of the planet from the Darling, a delirium orbital born of a two-terrestrial war. The Krumlau, the curved barrel for shooting without exposing yourself. Among the strangest yet most pragmatic inventions in the Nazi arsenal was the Krumlau, a rifle accessory that looked like something out of a cartoon but responded to a real need on the battlefield: shoot without exposing oneself. It was a curved barrel, a metal extension which was attached to the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, allowing the soldier shooting at an angle, whether from a corner, a trench, or the inside of an armored vehicle. The idea arose in 1943 when the German High Command began to observe the devastating casualties their troops suffered in combat. Urban, especially on fronts like Stalingrad. Take a corner, to look out by a window, either advance in a trench narrow could mean the death snapshot. Was necessary to devise a system that would allow combat without exposing oneself to the direct line of enemy fire. Waffenfabrik Karl Walter GmbH was responsible for developing the solution. It involved an attachable tubular accessory, initially made of reinforced steel, which bent the rifle barrel at an angle of between 30 degrees and 45 degrees. Several versions were designed: the Krumlau 30, intended for infantry, the Krumlau 45 for tank operations, and an experimental 90-degree version, which was quickly discarded due to its practical uselessness. The system included a small mirror periscopic that rode about the sight of the weapon, allowing the soldier to see what was on the other side of the wall or around the corner. In theory, this allowed for shooting with a certain degree of accuracy without exposing oneself directly. In practice, however, the invention was fraught with complications. The main problem was physical. Since the projectiles to cross a tube curved at high speed, they suffered significant deviation, which reduced both the accuracy as well as the speed of the shot. In addition, internal friction generated extremely high wear fast of the cannon. The first evidence showed that the Krumlau had a lifespan of only 200 shots before it completely deteriorated. Worse still, many shells fragmented inside the accessory due to the forced curve, generating a cloud of shrapnel that was dangerous even for the shooter. In some cases, the bullets partially exploded inside the barrel, damaging the weapon and injuring the soldier. Despite these limitations, more than 500 units were manufactured and issued primarily to tank crews and urban assault squads. The Panzer Krumlau, especially designed for be mounted in the hatch on tanks, such as the Panzer IV or Tiger, allowed the crew to fire at enemy troops without having to leave the vehicle, offering a considerable advantage in urban environments. The Krumlau did not change the course of the war, nor did it become a mass accessory, but demonstrates the willpower of the regime Nazi by experiment even with the most basic principles of ballistics in order to gain an advantage in combat. It was an improvised response, desperate and technically ingenious to the hell of urban warfare that Germany had unleashed and then suffered in own flesh. After the war, some of these devices fell into the hands of the Allies and were studied with interest, although not replicated. Their real usefulness was so limited as his endurance mechanics. In the war, Cold, Israel, Korea of the South, and the US briefly revived the concept in modern versions for counter-terrorism operations, but always as an experimental curiosity. Brewster Buffalo, the enemy plane the Nazis tested. Among the many mysteries that arose after the fall of the Third Reich, one of the most unusual was the discovery of an American aircraft in the hands of the Nazis, the Brewster F-2A Buffalo, a fighter that, although considered obsolete by the Allies since 1942, was object of study intensive by part of the Luftwaffe. That toward an American device in the hangars of the Reich? The answer reveals a story of espionage, reverse engineering, and desperate experimentation. The Brewster Buffalo was the first carrier-based monoplane fighter in the United States, introduced in the late 1930s. Designed by the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation, it was one of the first all-metal fighters in the American arsenal. However, despite its initial advances, it was quickly surpassed by models like the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, either he mythical P-51 Mustang. In combat, especially in the Pacific, the Buffalo proved to be slow, unmaneuverable, and vulnerable, earning the contempt of many of its own pilots. However, before being relegated, the model was exported to several countries, among they Finland. Over there, during the War of Winter and the second during World War II, Finnish pilots achieved impressive successes against Soviet aircraft using the Brewster Buffalo, which they nicknamed Taivan Helmi, or the Pearl of Heaven. Its effectiveness in Finnish hands caught the attention of the High Command German, especially because the Finns were allies of the Reich on the Eastern Front. Through these ties, Germany obtained at least one intact Buffalo unit, probably through exchange with Finland, to be evaluated by engineers of the Luftwaffe. The intention was know in depth the capabilities, weaknesses, and design of the airplane's allies, and to the same time find applicable solutions to their own models of combat. The Buffalo was transferred to the Rechlin Test Station, the most important aeronautical development center of the Third Reich. There, German technicians dismantled it, analyzed its structure, and subjected it to flights of proof and compared his performance with models own, such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf F190. The technical verdict was mixed. While they acknowledged some virtues of the design, such as its structural strength and his visibility frontal, also criticized severely his low power-to-weight ratio and poor performance at altitude. However, the information obtained from this analysis allowed for improved pilot training Germans who would face American models on the Western Front. The fact that the Brewster Buffalo ended up in the hands of the Reich reveals the breadth of the German technical intelligence network and its obsessive need to understand the enemy in every way. Germany also conducted similar tests on other captured aircraft, either delivered by countries' allies, either neutrals, such as the British Spitfire or the American P-38 Lightning. After the war, the Buffalo was recovered by the Allies along with other experimental examples that the Nazis had accumulated. Although it was never a decisive aircraft, its role as an object of study shows how even a relegated machine can become a key piece in the technological race of a total war. The Brewster Buffalo, despised by many of its own pilots, thus became in the wrong hands into a valuable source of intelligence. In Rechlin, it flew not as a weapon, but as an unknown, an enemy who spoke the language of plans, data, and engineering. The Cursed Maus, the development of the Panzer VIII Maus. The Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus was the heaviest tank ever built. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche and produced by Krupp, the Maus was conceived as a super panzer that I had to break any line defensive ally through extreme armor and overwhelming firepower. Its development began in 1942 under direct orders from Hitler, who favored each time further the designs of armament colossal. The Maus had a weight total of 188 tons, which made it unviable for the most of the bridges and paths. It measured 10.2 meters long, 3.71 meters wide, and 3.63 meters high, with a crew of 6. The main armament was a 128mm KWK 44L/55 gun, equivalent to that used by the Jagdtiger tank destroyers, accompanied by a coaxial 75mm KWK-44L Otuz Alti Nokta Besinci gun. This combination allowed it to engage armored targets as well as infantry and fortifications. The frontal armor reached 240mm in the turret and 200mm in the hull, making it practically invulnerable to Allied anti-tank weapons of the time. The engine was one of its biggest problems. Two variants were tested: a Daimler-Benz MB engine 509 gasoline engine and an experimental MB 517 diesel engine. Both were coupled to an electric generator that drove two electric motors on the tracks, following a system of propulsion hybrid. Without embargo, the speed maximum was lower to 20 km per hour, with extremely limited range. They were built two prototypes between 1944 and 1945, one of they with turret and other without it. Both were tested at Kummersdorf and Böblingen but never saw combat, real. To the approach the forces Soviet, the tanks were partially destroyed by their crews. The Red Army later captured the remains and assembled a functional unit from components of both prototypes. The Maus reflected a philosophy of warfare based on brute force, incompatible with the logistical and tactical needs of the modern battlefield. Its size, fuel consumption, and mobility limited made it a symbol of technical excess and strategic disconnection of the German High Command in the final years of the conflict. Project Habacook, the ice carrier against U-boats. During the Second World War, the oceans were fields of battle so as lethal as the trenches or the skies. The North Atlantic, in particular, became a living hell for Allied convoys, harassed relentlessly by German U-boats. Faced with this constant threat, unusual ideas emerged. Of the most surprising one was born in the mind of an eccentric scientist and even found echoes in Winston Churchill. We're talking about Project Habacook, a plan to build a gigantic aircraft carrier made of ice. Although the project was British, Germany had partial knowledge of it through naval espionage, and the history of its development and abandonment is also part of the strange technological legacy left by World War II. Its connection with the Nazis wasn't direct but strategic. It was a response to the initial supremacy of U-boats in the Atlantic. The idea was to create an immense floating structure capable of withstanding torpedoes and supporting heavy bombers, from which convoys from Iceland could be escorted and protected until North Africa. The project was proposed by Geoffrey Pike, a visionary with no academic training, formal but with ideas revolutionary. Pike suggested use a mixture of ice and wood pulp called pykrete, a material that not only floated but that was further resistant to the impacts than pure ice and melted much more slowly. Pykrete could, in theory, withstand torpedo attacks, cannon fire, and enemy fire, and could be easily repaired simply by pouring more water on it. He design and foresaw a platform more than 600 meters long and 90 meters wide, with a crew of more than 3,000 men, electric motors to move at low speed, and internal hangars for tens of airplanes. But construction was complex. Keeping pykrete frozen on the high seas required a continuous internal refrigeration system. Furthermore, the total weight exceeded 2 million tons. In 1943, a prototype was built on Patricia Lake in Alberta, Canada. It was only 18 meters long, but served to demonstrate that the material worked and was viable on a small scale. However, problems soon began to arise. The logistical cost was astronomical, continuous refrigeration was unsustainable, and Allied advances in conventional aircraft carriers made the development of an ice colossus unnecessary. At the same time, the Third Reich was already losing the Battle of the Atlantic due to radar, air escorts, and increased Allied naval production. The Habacook was consequently cancelled in 1944. The Canadian prototype was abandoned and, over time, quietly melted away. The Habacook project was never known to the public during the war. It was declassified, decades later becoming a fascinating anecdote of Allied ingenuity and desperation. Although conceived by the British, it represents an indirect response to the technical and destructive capacity of the Nazi enemy, particularly the power of its U-boats. That dominated the oceans with a lethal effectiveness during the early years of the conflict. Today, the Habacook is remembered as one of the most improbable ideas of the entire war. A mixture of science, ice, and blind faith in the impossible, a frozen aircraft carrier dreamed up in the midst of a fiery war. Nazi fire balloons, the hot air weapon that crossed borders. In the final years of the Third Reich, as Allied bombs rained down on Berlin and the Eastern Front collapsed, some sectors of the Nazi high command turned their attention to a strategy that seemed primitive but contained subversive potential: fire balloons. Inspired in part by ancient Eastern technologies and modern Japanese experiments, Germany developed a system of balloons loaded with explosives and incendiaries that, carried by air currents, could reach enemy territory without the need for pilots or aircraft. Although the project did not reach the scale of the Japanese Fogle program, which launched more than 9,000 balloons against the United States, the Nazi fire balloons, they arrived to unfold experimentally in Europe. The aim was use balloons full hydrogen or helium to transport incendiary charges, aerial mines or propaganda devices, taking advantage of the air currents over the Canal of the Seine, or even, according to some documents, attempting to reach Scotland or North Africa. The balloons were constructed from lightweight materials such as waxed paper or celluloid, and their lift was achieved using hydrogen, a dangerous solution, but accessible due to the shortage of helium. The navigation system was completely passive, and the balloons were simply released on specific days when wind patterns were favorable. Some included rudimentary timing mechanisms that released the explosives after an estimated flight time, while others simply carried the fixed payload to impact. A more sophisticated variant included small white phosphorus incendiary bombs, which sought out provoke fires forestry, either damage to agricultural facilities. Although their impact was minor in tactical terms, they generated uncertainty among the defences. Enemies, especially in England, where the unexpected appearance of floating objects and explosives generated constant alerts. One of the best documented episodes occurred in 1944, when several balloons launched from Brittany fell in rural areas of southwest England, causing small fires in farmland. The British government, aware of the psychological nature of the attack, ordered all media coverage censored to prevent panic. Beyond the physical damage, the German balloon served a symbolic function, demonstrating that even in its final stages, the Third Reich could still export destruction beyond its borders. Some balloons carried propaganda leaflets signed with phrases like "Die Luft gehört uns," meaning "the air belongs to us," reminding the enemy that air dominance was not yet absolute. After the end of the war, Allied intelligence services found documents about these experiments in Luftwaffe archives. Unexploded balloon remains were also discovered in French, Dutch, and Scottish fields. Good he-scope operational was limited, the idea interested to the Cold War strategists. The United States and the USSR studied the use of balloons as vectors for espionage, communication, and even bacteriological weapons. The German precedent, however, remained a technical oddity, an archaic attempt to wage a war aerial without airplanes in a context where the Allied technological superiority was already overwhelming. The Nazi fire balloons did not change the course of the conflict, but evidenced the provision German to explore any means, even the most rudimentary, to take the war to the last corner of the map. Schwera Gustaf, the largest cannon ever built. In a war where the scale of destruction seemed to know no bounds, Nazi Germany built a weapon so colossal it defies all modern logic: the Schwera Gustaf, the largest cannon ever deployed in combat. Its size, weight, and power made it a legend of military engineering, a work of industrial titanism that, however, was as impractical as it was symbolic. The Schwera Gustaf was developed by the company Krupp to order straight of Adolf Hitler in the late 1930s. His goal was clear: destroy the Maginot Line fortifications, the underground wall and steel that protected the border eastern France. This required a weapon capable of piercing 7-meter-thick concrete walls or 1-meter-thick steel plates. The solution: a railway gun that could fire 7-ton shells over 40 kilometers away. The final design was simply monstrous. The Gustaf weighed 1,350 tons, was 47 meters long, and fired 800-millimeter caliber shells, larger than an adult man, using an explosive charge that reached an effective range of 30 kilometers. Its power was such that upon impact the shells could penetrate more than 10 meters of ground before detonating, but all that strength came at a price. Mounting of the cannon required ways double specials broad, further of 2,000 men, and several weeks of preparation. The Gustaf could only move on straight rails, and its firing range was limited to what its rail slewing system allowed. It was, in short, a stationary, gigantic and vulnerable weapon. its only role active he gave in 1942 during his siege of Sevastopol in Crimea. There, he fired about 48 shells at a bombing that destroyed underground bunkers, ammunition depots, and a base naval. The result was devastating, but at an enormous logistical cost. After use, the cannon required constant maintenance, and the wear on the steel tube was so severe high which could only fire 100 shots before needing replacement. A second example, the Dora, was built and deployed to Stalingrad but never saw combat. Mobile, fast-moving aerial warfare made the Gustaf a technical dinosaur, a beast of the past caught in a war of the future. To protect it from bombing, the Gustaf was camouflaged with tarpaulins and nets, but its size made it vulnerable from the sky. At the end of the conflict, both guns were destroyed by German forces to prevent capture. The Allies found wrecks of the Gustaf near Auerbach, Saxony in April 1945. Its parts were examined by Soviet and American experts, but the concept was quickly discarded in the age of air power and the guided bombs. And yet, the Schwera Gustaf left a fingerprint indelible in military history, not for its effectiveness but for what it represented, the will to build the most enormous weapon without matter his utility real. Was a statement of power, a visual rather than a strategic threat, a mixture of engineering and propaganda. Project Deriza, the giant underground weapons complex that never saw the light of day. Deep in Poland's Owl Mountains lies one of the most enigmatic vestiges of Nazi Germany. It is an extensive tunnel complex, reportedly built between 1943 and 1945 in the Lower Silesia region of Poland, known as Project Deriza or the Giant. This underground network featured corridors that stretched for kilometers, connecting underground chambers, and was part of a massive project orchestrated by the SS, who used forced laborers to carry it out. Some historians believe the plan was to create a center of command, sure for officials of high-ranking officials, and even a replica of the Führerbunker for harbor to Hitler in his domination of the Eastern Front, while others argue that it could have been intended for the development of advanced weapons or the stockpiling of resources. Although its destination was never confirmed, since the project was cut short after the fall of Berlin to the Soviet Union, historians agree that the magnitude of the project was awesome. Miles of prisoners transferred from various concentration camps were forced to work in brutal conditions, excavating rocks and pouring concrete in a suffocating darkness. In certain sections, ventilation systems, heavy armored doors and railway lines appeared, indicating a grand design intended to withstand heavy bombardment. Even today, the maze unfinished seems disturbingly abandoned in the middle of construction, as if its creators had disappeared overnight. In fact, there are several myths linked to this extensive and mysterious network, which we will talk about further forward. In the present, Project Deriza. It can be visited as a tourist attraction, and those who enter the tunnels suffer tremendous chills thinking about the macabre nature of its construction. The Wolfs Lair, the Reich's strategic command center. In the dense forests of Gierlos, Poland, he finds the remains crumbled from one of the most secret and fortified complexes of the Germany Nazi. The Wolfs Lair, Adolf Hitler's first military headquarters on the Eastern Front, an intricate and vast complex of camouflaged bunkers, from where he directed the events that would seal the fate of the Third Reich. Built as the main headquarters of Adolf Hitler for organize his attack on the Soviet Union, this fort was more than just a command center. It was a fortress of terror comprised of 80 buildings with different uses. It was surrounded by 50 bunkers, booby traps, sniper nests, barbed wire, and a labyrinth of underground tunnels designed to satisfy the desire of a paranoid and megalomaniacal leader who distrusted every shadow and feared assassination at every turn. Even today, decades after the war, visitors who are able to visit the Wolfs Lair are baffled by its haunting remains. Slabs of concrete lay scattered by all he place, destroyed by German troops desperate to keep their secrets hidden. Even so, one of the most important aspects of the discovery of the Wolfs Lair was its complex network of hidden corridors and extraordinary escape routes that, curiously, were designed for destroy he complex in case the enemy managed to infiltrate or capture him. This fact revealed the Nazis' desperation to secure an escape route, or at least die trying. In the vicinity of the main complex, Hitler's theater of operations booby traps were placed in crucial sections so that large portions of terrain could be instantly destroyed in the face of advancing enemies. Engineers covered the bunkers with camouflage nets to avoid detection by Allied aircraft, and cannons were mounted anti-aircraft guns nearby to counter possible bombing. However, the most famous event linked to this sinister complex occurred on July 20, 1944, when Colonel Klaus from Stauffenberg tried end with the life of Hitler with a briefcase bomb as part of an internal conspiracy that went down in history as Operation Valkyrie. Although the exact location of the attempt is to the day of today bit clear, it true is that the explosion leveled the complex, but Hitler survived, although the failed assassination attempt let several injuries. Then, of the failure of the Plan Valkyrie, the measure's security increased and he added further barriers and traps, but, to way of despite its formidable defenses, Soviet forces finally reached the site in early 1945, prompting the retreating German troops to detonate hundreds of explosives, reducing the lair to ruins. Today, only huge concrete fragments remain, and some shelters collapsed that remember to the visitors the terror and secrecy of a regime that sometime conspired within those walls to try to conquer the world. The Nazi atomic bomb and uranium cubes, the Third Reich's nuclear project. Of all the inventions and secret projects of the Third Reich, none has generated more speculation, fear, and historical research than its failed attempt to build an atomic bomb. Unlike aeronautical experiments or visible superweapons, the German nuclear program was deliberately hidden, fragmented across laboratories, and barely understood by its own leadership. However, it left an undeniable physical trace. An example of this is the tesseracts, mysterious uranium cubes found after the war, tangible remains of an ambition that could have changed the fate of the planet. The Nazi nuclear program officially began in 1939, barely weeks after German scientists, including Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, discovered nuclear fission. Meanwhile, in the United States, this discovery would trigger the Manhattan Project. In Germany, however, the effort fell under the auspices of the Uranverein Uranium Club, a network of physicists such as Werner Heisenberg, Kurt Diebner, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, scattered among universities and military laboratories. The main German obstacle was not conceptual but practical. The scarcity of resources, internal disorganization, and the lack of a single authority to direct the program prevented the consolidation of an effort similar to the American one. While the Americans, they invested thousands of millions and they used a further of 130,000 people in their laboratories, the Germans worked with minimal budgets and barely a handful of scientists, too often at odds with each other. Despite everything, the Reich made progress in certain technical aspects. In several facilities, such as the Haigerloch laboratory, hidden in a cave in southern Germany, were used to develop prototypes of experimental reactors. This is where they were found in 1945 tens of small cubes of uranium metal, of about 5 centimeters on a side, suspended on wire frames inside a heavy water moderator. The purpose was to generate a controlled chain reaction, the first step in developing an atomic bomb. Each cube weighed about 2 kilograms and was made of natural uranium. In total, it is estimated that Germany produced more than 600 of these blocks, distributed among several laboratories. But the reactor design was flawed and the materials insufficient. German scientists never achieved a self-sustaining reaction, while in December 1942, Enrico Fermi and his team had already achieved it in the United States. The discovery of the cubes by the Allied forces not only confirmed the existence of the program Nuclear Nazi, but that accelerated the urgency of the Alsos project, a mission secret for track scientists, nuclear materials, and sabotage any German advances. The objective was twofold. First, to prevent Hitler from gaining access to nuclear, and in second place, prevent the Soviets from appropriating their technology. The question that has persisted for decades is, how close was Germany to developing a working atomic bomb? Most historians agree that, although they had the theory, lacked of media, time, and organization. Heisenberg himself, in conversations secretly recorded during his detention in England, hinted that they did not even know exactly how far away they were Americans. Without embargo, the fact that so many uranium cubes were preserved and that sustained reactions had been attempted secretly underground fueled later theories about hidden tests, parallel developments, and even technology transfers to South America or Egypt. To this day, some of those cubes he preserves in museums and laboratories in the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom, like relics of a scientific nightmare that never materialized. The Nazi atomic bomb was a phantom. It never existed, but it was close enough to inspire fear and far enough away to not alter history. Those small metal cubes condensed the greatest threat of the 20th century, the possibility that evil could have access to the absolute power of destruction.